All right, we're going to look at the magician's nephew today, which is not the first in the Narnia stories that Lewis wrote, but in terms of the foundations of the whole world that Lewis creates in the Narnia stories, it is. It deals with the account of the creation. So in a letter that Lewis wrote later on to a young girl by the name of Anne Jenkins, he writes that the whole Narnian story is about Christ, and mentions that he, in the magician's nephew, it tells us about the creation and how evil entered Narnia. Whereas the Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, which we dealt with last time, deals with the crucifixion and the resurrection. So it's there in Lewis's own words that it is about Christ. So for those of us who've been reading Narnia that way, there's warrant for doing so. But we'll also notice that only three of them are really specifically relating to Christ, and that's the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the magician's nephew, and then the last battle. The other four, it's more implicit and deals with consequences and various sorts of things. And I'll come to that in a bit. I did want to say before I moved on and forgot that with respect to the abolition of man and its commentary on education, but also its application to bioethics and so forth, a couple of other books come to mind that are good. Medicine After the Holocaust, very good. And the New Medicine, Life and Death After Hippocrates. I mentioned that the Hippocratic Oath no longer contains the injunction, first do no harm. That has been scrubbed from the Hippocratic Oath. And in our day, people place too little value on words and what they mean, so they just more or less shrug their shoulders and say, okay, that's no big deal. I beg to differ, and the whole world that Lewis constructs and Tolkien constructs, we'll see next semester, is really dependent on its grounding in words. And it's not insignificant. Both men are philologists, and the names of characters and the details are actually significant. And it's a different approach to the humanities than the one that the human sciences take, where in the 20th century, language becomes very arbitrary, and anything can refer to anything pretty much. And there's no sense of words referring to something in its essence, and by changing the word or by changing the referent, we're doing some sort of damage in our apprehension of reality. But that is, I think, what both Lewis and Tolkien would have held. I also wanted to mention to you a very good book that I have not yet mentioned, but need to, called Planet Narnia. And I say I wouldn't have done it before now anyway, because we just started dealing with Narnia per se. But this book goes beyond Narnia in its scope, insofar as it reflects on the significance of cosmology in Lewis's whole corpus of writing. He uses it as a way of ordering all sorts of things that don't seem to fit together. And in this case, he's going to suggest that the seven heavens that we saw in the Ptolemaic cosmos relate to the 7 books of the Narnia Chronicles. It's very interesting. But it goes beyond that, because then he starts seeing it in the science fiction trilogy and also in some of his other works. And I'm not going to follow him slavishly, Michael Ward, although I think he is of great value and worth reading. But it seems to me in this discussion today, dealing with the magician's nephew, is particularly important because it's dealing with the idea of Venus. And Venus, as everyone knows, is the goddess of love. And love is one of the leitmotifs of all of Lewis's work. it's literally all over the place. And I think it guides his understanding, and if we want to understand Lewis's thought, if only his fiction, but even if we want to understand his apologetics work or his academic work, he meditates and reflects repeatedly on what love means. All of the connotations, all of the contradictions. And with respect to the four loves, which we'll look at towards the end of, it's always hard to arrange the books on this course. The stuff I do at the end, I wish I'd done at the beginning, and vice versa. I think if I began with, or if I concluded with literary criticism, people would got bored and wouldn't have wanted to read it. And also the literary criticism ends up being the foundation. It's sort of the grammar for what follows. It's not his speculation on these things. He's basing it on his scholarship. In other words, he's basing it on what he sees thinkers, writers, theologians before him reflect upon, and he is then building on what they've done. So we take Lewis as a sort of a foundational figure, but really he's at the latest iteration of a long-standing, deep tradition. He just happens to gather it together very nicely and very beautifully. But in the Four Loves, he argues what he says in the first chapter of The Abolition of Man, that there is something called ordo amoris. There's an order of love and a hierarchy of love. And that human loves, which are ever so important to us, can be inordinate. They can be misplaced. And that's how this little novel begins. It begins with something that is very near to Lewis's own biography. He lost his mother, Flora, when he was a boy. And we pick up this story with titled The Wrong Door, the first chapter. This is a story about something that happened long ago when your grandfather was a child. It was a very important story because it shows how all the comings and goings between our own world and the land of Narnia first began. So he's introducing to his already existing readership of a very devout following of, just like in Harry Potter, we have an audience of kids waiting for the latest installment of a book to come out, and he addresses them explicitly here. Here's the story about how something happened when your grandfather was a child, so it's that far back. Just imaginatively. I mean, if he's talking about creation, it goes a lot further back than that. But never mind, it doesn't matter. From a child's perspective, the oldest person in the universe is grandpa or grandma, right? And this is when they were young. That's how far back it is. So anything beyond that, it's not a living relative. There's no actually imaginative connection per se. It's an abstraction. These days we might have a photo of somebody that lived back then, but we've never met that person. He wants to connect it with somebody that is real for the child, and therefore puts it at that stage. And this is how all the comings and goings between our own world and the land of Narnia first began. And where is it? Well, it's back in the 19th century when Sherlock Holmes is in Baker Street. Well, when Lewis writes, Sherlock Holmes was at he's born in 1898. Lewis is. And Sherlock Holmes is in the Victorian period, so it's that time. It's on Baker Street. And what does he come across? There's in London a girl called Polly Plummer. I'll get to her name in a minute. She comes along and she sees, out of curiosity, a boy. A strange boy. He was very grubby. Could hardly have been grubbier if he had first rubbed his hands in the earth and then had a good cry and then dried his face with his hands. As a matter of fact, this was very nearly what he'd been doing. "Hello," said Polly. "Hello," said the boy. "What's your name?" "Polly," said Polly. "What's yours?" "Digory," said the boy. "I say, what a funny name," said Polly. "It isn't half so funny as Polly," said Digory. "Yes, it is," said Polly. "No, it isn't," said Digory. At any rate, I do wash my face, said Polly, which is what you need to do, especially after. And then she stopped. She had been going to say, after you've been blubbing. But she thought that wouldn't be polite. All right, I have then, said Digory in a much louder voice like a boy who was so miserable that he didn't care who knew he had been crying. And so would you, he went on, if you'd lived all your life in the country and had a pony and a river at the bottom of the garden and then been brought to live in a beastly hole like this. London isn't a hole, said Polly indignantly, but the boy was too wound up to take any notice of her, and he went on, and if your father was away in India and you had to come and live with an aunt and an uncle who's mad, who would like that? And if the reason was that they were looking after your mother, and if your mother was ill and was going to die, then his face went the wrong sort of shape, as it does if you're trying to keep back your tears. I didn't know, I'm sorry. So it begins with an instance of very real trauma and heartache for a young boy, which Lewis himself had experienced. That's how he launches the whole story of Narnia, with these two characters of Polly and Digory. And the context that Digory is going to lose his mother. It is in the backdrop of the whole story, actually. And it doesn't go away. So we don't meet the mother, by the way, till chapter 15. But she's on his mind, on the boy's mind. This name Digory, and Polly, let me say something about Digory and Polly. Before I come back to this, I mentioned that I would say something about this. Let me see my notes here. I had it. Digory means almost lost. Anglo-Saxon, he's plucked it out of a source. The boy Digory is almost lost. Polly is a very English name, and it's a derivative. It's a name from a name. The root name is Mary. Then it becomes Molly, then it becomes Polly. If you know any Mollys, probably not. You do know Marys. What we are meeting here at the outset of this story, a man or a boy whose name is Digory, who's going to end up being a significant character, even though he was almost lost, is Adam and Eve. Polly representing Mary, the archetypal mother, and Digory representing the archetypal father. And we're going to have an encounter in the garden and a temptation to fall. And Digory's almost lost. What is the nature of the temptation for Digory? And how is he almost lost? That's going to be the whole thrust of the novel. That becomes the central act in which the whole of Narnia, upon which it is built. And as I say, the possibility here is that Digory's love for his mother is going to so color his actions that he will do anything to save his mother. And you can imagine a little boy who has lost his mother and who is so struck by it as Lewis was, will deeply empathize with his character, and so will his audience. You can imagine. Maybe you don't have to imagine. Facing that scenario and the possibility of preventing that from happening. But I say it is there. His concern for her is brought to our attention in this chapter And in fact, in every chapter of the book, except for the 4th, 5th, and the 8th chapter. So we never forget that his relationship with his mother, for all the other relationships, is in his mind. He hasn't forgot about Mum. And the fact that Mum is in her sick bed and is most certainly going to die, that nothing's going to stop that. And he desperately wishes it were otherwise, and he can't get it away. Well, if you're experiencing grief on that level of somebody that is that important to you, even though you carry on with other people, you don't forget that. And he doesn't forget it. And Lewis brings that to our attention by bringing it up in the chapters. So it's there, always there. And that's important as a literary device. It points us to the central crisis in the play where a decision has to be made, namely, will Digory take one of the apples from the trees and take it to his mother to heal her? And the reason that there's a crisis there is because he's been told by Aslan to bring the apple to him. Directly. Don't do anything else with it. Bring it to me. And he is faced with a terrible dilemma. The thing that he most wants to do in the world is to have his mother healed. But Aslan has said, bring it to me. What do you do? His loves are in conflict. That's the point. So this is an illustration of what we see argued and expressed much more exhaustively in the 4 loves. We'll get to that later on the course. And so we'll see it exemplified. We will see this same issue presented throughout Lewis's work, and we'll look at some of it. So the rival claims, the tensions between natural love and supernatural love. It's there in this book. It's in the 4 loves. It's also in the Great Divorce, which we will look at. It's portrayed there. And finally, it's in Till We Have Faces, which is the myth of Cupid and Psyche. Psyche relating to Venus. It's also in A Grief Observed, by the way, but we're not dealing with that. But that was written, that was written by Lewis, and he didn't even publish it under his own name because he was concerned. By this time, he was a public figure, a sort of spokesman for Christianity, and he found himself so grief-stricken that he could not put on a brave public face and deal with it in a way that he wanted to be a model for others. But it was genuine grief. He talks about it. In that case, it was dealing with the death of his wife, Joy Davidman. So he experienced it differently. In the first, it was his mother, and now it was his wife, which, if you've ever seen Shadowlands, that movie, it's portrayed in that, fictionalized. So Lewis is, for him, this is, it's an extraordinary thing, and this is how academia really ought to work. Your life is connected with your reading and your thinking. And it intertwines for him in that way. But Digory is told that if his mother were to eat one of the apples, she would get better, but he mustn't steal one, because if he did, she would get better, but she wouldn't enjoy getting any better. She'd be unhappy. Right? Great temptation. And he's a young boy, thrust into the situation. I said it was Adam and Eve, and I think it is the story of Adam and Eve. Lewis himself tips it off when he says it's about creation and so forth. What's with these 2 kids? Well, we have a Mary, a paradigmatic mother figure, the mother figure, Mary. Note that it's not Adam and Eve, though, right? It's not Eve, it's Mary, because Mary doesn't do what Eve did. And Digory won't do what Adam did either. He's almost lost, but he's not lost, and he won't get lost. We know if we've read the story. But there's a great deal of connection here between the human couple and what they do in relation to the garden. And so let me just say a bit about that. And this is going back to the Hebrew in Genesis 1. The word Adam refers to the man, and the word Adamah to the soil. He comes out of the soil. His name's a play on that. And the man in Hebrew is Ish, and the woman is Isha. And there's a parallel that we're to see here between the man and what he's to do, which is to work the soil, and the man and the woman, which I don't want to say he's to work the woman, but there's to be fruitful and multiply and fill and subdue the earth. There's a union of purpose here. There's a compatibility. It's a calling. It's not just creation. Don't think just in terms of abstract biology. There's a sense of purposiveness about this. And Digory and Polly will eventually have children. It's an important part of the creation story. We'll come to that when we look at the magician's nephew a little bit more closely. But as far as Venus goes, here's where I wanted to show some pictures. Let's see if I can get this up here now. You might have seen this before. You might not have seen it. Oh, it goes up too high there. Pull it down just a bit more. There we go. This is from Robert Flood's book on creation of the earth and so forth. And the up here in the Hebrew letters, the Jehovah, Yahweh. We see a hand coming down of the cloud to nature. But she appears an awful lot like someone else we might see. Venus. Right? There's a striking similarity, and I don't think it's without meaning either. But we can also see this is connected with the whole cosmology. But what we have here, and this is, you can't see it because it's not very, this is a little ape with a pair of compasses measuring the earth, who's also held by a chain from nature. And the ape represents mankind. This is not proto-Darwinianism, by the way. It's saying that man imitates everything like an ape. It apes things. He apes what nature leads him to do. But nature is, in a sense, love personified. Love in its fertility, but also in its ordering. It in a sense, and Lewis is going to argue this, and I'm going to argue it here, and Michael Ward argues it, that Venus represents both the male and the female to some degree, because there's fruitfulness there. You can't have a woman who's fruitful without a male. There has to be a compatibility there, and they come together. So she, representing God's creative ways, is going to then be aped by man and so forth, and she represents the whole of the cosmos. So even though Venus is only one of the planets, she represents more than one of the planets. And Ward notes that about the Venus, that she is associated also all too often with humor, and this is the most There's more humor in this particular book in the Chronicles of Narnia than any of the others. It's a lot of laughter. Ward says that the lightness of tone is achieved partly through authorial comment, so he comments that they're laughing. Through example, on the toughness of ants, of how certain houses always smell like mutton, how everyone had lots of servants in those days, even though, of course, not everyone did. The aristocrats did, everyone else didn't. Everyone didn't have servants. And it's partly by putting laughter throughout the story. There are roars of laughter regularly. People just laugh, break out in laughter, including the animals. And even the first joke, a jackdaw, and I'm going to just read this. The jackdaw, all the other animals began making various queer noises which are their way of laughing, and which, of course, no one has ever heard in our world. They tried at first to repress it, but Aslan said, "Laugh and fear not, creatures. Now that you are no longer dumb and witless, you need not always be grave. For jokes, as well as justice, come in with speech." So they all let themselves go. And there was such merriment that the jackdaw himself plucked up courage again and perched on the cab horse's head between its ears, clapping its wings and said, Aslan, Aslan, have I made the first joke? Will everybody always be told how I made the first joke? No, little friend, said the lion, you have not made the first joke. You have only been the first joke. Now, normally, you're very angry when you're the butt of the joke. But in this case, there's no sin. I'm very happy to be this. We're all laughing. Then everybody laughed more than ever, but the jackdaw didn't mind and laughed just as loud. Now, this is all over there. And Ward's comment, and I think it's appropriate, in Edwardian England, so after Victoria, early 20th century, there's this ferocious, this etiquette, the stiff upper lip, the top hats, Uncle Andrew buttoned up and so forth. So very prim and proper. Everything has its place. And on the other hand, we have Jadis, who is a sort of Venus personified, but Venus without fertility. In fact, he calls her a sort of a Lilith, was actually mentioned in the story as well. Lilith being a sort of, you know who Lilith is, by chance? In, I think, Jewish mythology about Scripture, she was Adam's first wife. She was a real shrew. And got rid of her and brought Eve about because she was too full of herself, basically. She was a narcissist, whatever, an impossible woman, and they did away with her. Sort of representation of the fall before the fall. Again, not a real figure, but is real in terms of mythology, a Lilith. And she's portrayed quite regularly here as extraordinarily beautiful. All the men are full of desire for her, especially Uncle Andrew, and that is itself comic. So and when she destroys the people of Charn, remember that world that she came from, Digory's comment is just the sort of, it's very British, stiff upper lip. He says, well, that's rather hard luck on them. It's like the whole world's been destroyed. I mean, talk about understatement. Well, it's rather hard luck on them. And she, Polly says that she was absolute bosh from beginning to end. That's her comment on Jadis. Her Aunt Letty calls her a drunken hussy, which you can imagine an old woman, with a sense of sexual etiquette and decorum. You've got this 7-foot-tall woman improperly dressed and behaving very unladylike. Well, this is, again, she's a drunken hussy. So lots of humor there. The two sources, and I think this is important as well, and I think he's correct about this. Again, Ward is very good on this. He says that she has two sources. One is from the warrior goddess Ishtar, who is Venus in Babylonian mythology. This is important. She represents Babylon the Great. And we're thinking in biblical terms and the significance of Babylon. She represents Babylon, a sort of female sexuality that is wrong. And when I say female sexuality, a female sort of love that is distorted and infertile and self-directed. It's an inordinate love of a sort. It leads to idolatry. It's not for no reason that there are cults of love throughout the ancient world and to this day. People sing songs about love. They know how important love is to them and to everyone else. And love motivates people. People recognize this. There's a reason why we have a goddess of love. So she represents Ishtar, the Babylonian Venus, especially worshipped by the Ninevites, by the way. And the Ninevites were amongst the people of ancient biblical times, the cruelest of cruel. They piled up their victims' heads, skulls in great piles. Right? And this is who, remember, Jonah is sent to the Ninevites to preach them to repent. They do repent, which drives him crazy. Because he knew they were going to repent, because he knew that God would show mercy to them and whatever, and he doesn't want to show them mercy because these are the worst people you can ever imagine, the Ninevites. So when she refers to Charn as that great city, it's an echo of Jonah's description of Nineveh, that great city. But it's a great city that is hostile to God and all of God's purposes. And yet God shows mercy towards it. Remember, if you know the book of Jonah? So she's a representation of Ishtar, so the Babylonian Venus, and the city that goes with it then, Charn in this case. And the second is Lilith, sort of a Venus infernal. Emphasized throughout, she is beautiful. Years afterwards, when he was an old man, Digory said that he had never in all his life known a woman so beautiful. This is Digory. She has a white, beautiful hand. She's 7 foot tall and dazzlingly beautiful. Her height was nothing compared with her beauty. And in addition, she's vain. She knows who the most beautiful person is. She's like the wicked, in what is it? Is it Snow White? Who's the fairest of them all? She knows who the fairest of them all. She is, and there is no one fairer. Unlike in Snow White, there is no one fairer. She is it, and she loves herself. It will not go beyond that. Now, so she speaks of my beauty and my magic, and when she hears the children mention Uncle Andrew, she assumes that he must have seen her face in some magic mirror to have brought her here. He must have seen my face. That's why I'm here. It's my beauty. He didn't want my power. He wanted my beauty. For the love of my beauty, he sent you across the vast gulf between the world and world to ask my favor and to bring me to him. And when she sees him, she can't believe it. Like, this guy? Like, no man is going to satisfy her, but particularly not this fop in the top hat and the top coats. And so forth. And Uncle Andrew repeatedly talks about her. A damn fine woman. He's imagined some old middle-aged guy lusting after this 7 foot Venus. But she's self-sufficient. She does not need anyone else, and she just demands absolute worship. So it's a bit like the temptation, if you're acquainted with the Lord of the Rings series, that Galadriel leans towards. She could be worshipped as this sort of figure, in which case she would fall temptation to the power of the temptation of the ring. She would become like this queen, great and beautiful. All will love me in despair, right? That's what this woman is represented of. And so when we see that, the plot device, the rings and the different rings, and they move between worlds and so forth, when Digory and Polly are whirled between them, in chapter 3 we're told there are bright lights moving about in a black sky. Digory always thinks these were stars and even swears that he saw Jupiter quite close enough to see its moons. There's a connection here being made about the way Venus is meant to be portrayed, which is not as a woman, but as a woman who has her match in Jupiter. They're in close proximity. The purpose of Venus is properly met when she's understood in proximity to Venus. And they work together in that sense. And it's sort of shocking that this book, it's a children's book, so this is Lewis's problem here, is more about sex than any of the other books that he writes. It's there, it's implied. But it's certainly there. So King Frank and Queen Helen are told that they'll bring up children and grandchildren. Well, it's implied. And that that they and the children and grandchildren shall be blessed, and that they will be father and mother of many kings. Again, likewise, it talks about the effect of their union. And we know how that works out. But the sexual desire that all the male figures, including Digory, the young boy, feels towards Jadis, there's a tendency for it to become infertile, just as she is, to go the wrong way. And that's because all of the loves are potentially inordinate. They could just worship eros. We're going to come to that when we look at the four loves. Lewis talks about four. He talks about storge, which is familial love. He talks about philia, which is friendship love. He talks about eros, which is erotic love. And finally, he talks about agape love, which is the love of God. But all of them are sort of images of the highest form of love. And they have to be directed towards it as well, and they have to bow to it and it alone. But the temptation is to bow to one of the lower forms of love. So they could just worship eros. And again, the temptation is very strong there because it's connected to Jupiter, to God's love. It's very close in some ways. And so Lewis is presenting that, I think, repeatedly in this in ways that I think is quite profound. Comments and questions at this point? It's a really interesting picture, isn't it? From 16th century, I believe. But Lewis, because this is a children's book and because he has no interest in this, is not going to describe any sexual encounters. He's no interest in that. Other authors do that. Lewis would never do that. But it's implied. And it's implied, but it's also explicitly stated in how the Narnian universe comes about. So in the scenes, in the sort of climactic scenes, the stars burst out into song. This is a celebration of what's just happened. Well, what's just happening? The lion opened his mouth, but no sound came from it. He was breathing out a long, warm breath. It seemed to sway all the beasts as the wind sways a line of trees. Far overhead from beyond the veil of the blue sky which hid them, the stars sang again, a pure, cold, difficult music. Then there came a swift flash of fire, but it burnt nobody, either from the sky or from the lion itself, and every drop of blood tingled in the children's bodies, and the deepest, wildest voice they had ever heard was saying, "Narnia, Narnia, Narnia, awake, love." And the love here is not abstracted. It is actually concrete. Be fruitful, multiply. So there's a mention of warmth, the warm, the breeze, breath, the rocking, the sway, the tingling, and the burning. So there's lots of heat there, but without burning. The burning is misapplied, inordinate love. Does the awakening of Narnia come from the stars, or does it come from Aslan's speech? It's not entirely clear, but there is certainly illustrations that suggest this very thing. Now, what's interesting is this is the wood between the worlds, where you can almost feel the trees growing, tries to emphasize this, and Jadis hates this place. She can't stand it, and she can't exercise her powers there. She's totally robbed of all power. It's like, what is this place? The world, the wood between the worlds. What is this place exactly? It's a place of fecundity. And she feels herself shrinking. And once she's gone, she can't remember it. It's the very fertility that she hates. life. She hates life. And biological procreation is the means by which life is conveyed. And she hates this. She represents Venus, but Venus distorted and turned towards itself where there will be no life. There will be desire, but never fulfillment. The wood between the worlds has pools all over the place. Each gives access to a whole new creation. And it reminds us that moisture, as it says, is the prerequisite of generation. And creatures pop up from the water. Much as Botticelli's famous painting of Venus or Aphrodite coming from the sea foam pops up. It's an old myth. This is in the Uffizi Gallery in Italy. Good enough. So there is a sort of, you could think of this as an accomplishment of Venus then, but actually I think there's more at work than that. He's not associating it all with Mother Nature, with Mother Earth. You have to see behind this an interplay between God, who's portrayed ever in Lewis as masculine. Remember, Aslan is masculine. And Venus. And I'm going to come to this, and I think Ward's discussion of this is particularly good. And the other thing that we need to, and this is also an important thing to observe, is that Venus doesn't only give life, she also undoes death. So this is, I'll give the footnote if I can here. No, I don't have the footnote there. But her Venus's union with matter, that is the fertility of nature, is continually conquering death. It's life coming up from the soil. You think about things, they live, they die, but as fertility undoes the consequences of death. So unless the seed falls in the soil and dies, no life, right? But this is how life comes about. I mentioned the death of Digory's mother, or the imminent death of Digory's mother at the outset. She is called Mother with a capital M throughout. She seems to represent something more than herself. She only appears, as I say, in the one chapter, but she is mentioned over and over. He says that his mother was ill and was going to die. Mother, capital M. Why M? Capital M. How come? Very interesting. It's the author's choice to capitalize his mother there. Any thoughts? Why would Lewis capitalize his mother? Digory's mother there with a big capital M.
She's supposed to be representing nature.
It could be, but it could also represent the outsized place she holds in his psyche, in his inner life. His God is about to die. His mom, his whole world. It's the ground of his being. It comes out of her. She's about to die. Like when you lose your mother, it's devastating to a young child. You never recover from it. In the sense that you never forget it. And then you have to deal with the consequences of that. How do you move on from that? You don't move on in the sense that it ever goes away, but what do you do with the lesson of a death, of a mother? And he has placed her at this point that she is so significant that he can't deal with her loss, and he will do anything to prevent it. Now, her fatal illness is a plot device. It drives the whole plot. So death, and the death of a mother, a young boy's mother, is what moves the whole book. Some of it's actually some of Lewis's most touching prose, I think. This is very realistic, I think. And it allows him to bring in the double aspect of Venus, the fact that Venus is a celestial body, one of the heavenly bodies, the planet Venus, but also has very earthly implications and connections. We don't just worship the planet Venus, we worship what Venus represents in this world. And one of the things it represents is fertility and life, ongoing life. And he is this plot device of a fatal illness allows Lewis to pull in this idea of Venus to use it for a different purpose. And not only can a life be saved through Venus, the life in question is a mother, and mothers are associated with, as I say, both femininity and fertility. Now, Freud has a field day with all this, of course. Right? The Oedipus complex and so forth. He talks about this. He's reflecting on the same sorts of things, actually. It's very interesting. Both men, however different they are, and they're very different, are meditating on something very central as a motive for all sorts of human behavior. And it is there. As we know, Mrs. Kirk, Digory Kirk, does get healed. But it doesn't come about the way that Digory, who, again, is almost lost, intends it to happen or thinks about it happening. It happens rather indirectly. Remember, Digory is almost lost. Polly is a sort of Mary figure. Again, Polly, Mary, Molly, Polly. Digory goes to a garden in the west. What's the garden in the west? Aslan sends him to a garden in the west to pluck an apple. What is the apple? What is the tree from which he takes the apple? Is it the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? I mean, there are biblical allusions all over the place. Or is it the other tree? It's the other tree is the answer. It's the other tree. It's the tree of life. Right? It's going to give his mother life. But in this case, by taking of that tree which Adam and Eve could have eaten from, in this case, it's forbidden to take from that tree. So therefore, the tree of life becomes the tree of prohibition for him. What will he do with this? Well, the purpose of taking the tree, or the apple, is to do something very great. It's to heal the whole of Narnia. This is no small task. Because from its seed will arise a tree of protection that will protect this whole planet from the ravages of Jadis. So this is an epic task. And how epic is it? Well, for a young boy, the stakes can't be higher. You're going to save your mother, who's your goddess. You love your mom. But what's at stake? The whole planet. The fate of the planet's at stake. What will Digory do? Remember, Digory has inadvertently brought Jadis with him. When the planet was born, Jadis came along with him. She managed to grab hold in the connection and get there, even though he didn't want her to be there. She is there. And she's also present, by the way, interestingly, in the garden. tempting him, telling him not to do it, do something different. But as we know, he does do what he was requested. He gives the apple to Aslan. I think it's the hardest thing he ever did. Brings a tear to his eyes to have to do it, because he knows by saving this, he's killing that. He's condemning the other to die. There's a author by the name of Philip Pullman, the author of a trilogy, his Dark Materials trilogy, who's a very anti-C.S. Lewis figure about whom I've written, says that Lewis is totally unfair, and he guilts Digory into doing the right thing, etc. He says that, by the way, Pullman also lost his mother, lost a parent at a young age, so he, like Lewis, is drawn to this situation. He says that Lewis is cheating, he's exploiting the sympathy of the readers, and he fails to justify it as an integral part of the story. He says, so he's told that if his mother were to eat one of the apples, she would get better, but he mustn't steal one, because if he did, she would get better, and she wouldn't enjoy getting any better. She'd be unhappy. So, as a good boy, he doesn't do this, and as a reward for being a good boy, he's given the magic apple, and he comes back to the real world and gives the apple to his mother, and she gets better, and everything's happy. So it's a moral story, and he says it's a crude form of moralism. He's just telling kids to be good, and Pullman says, think what the passage is saying. It says that if your mother is dying, it depends on you whether she gets better or not. If you're a good boy, she'll get better. If you're not a good boy, she won't get better. He says it's very cruel. Lewis is a cruel man for putting it this way. How many children feel guilty because their mothers died, and it was because they weren't good enough? Actually, children do that, actually. This is one of the responses to grief, is people all around the person who's died wonder if it was something that they could have done that would have prevented it. And small children will do this, and it's probably because of this dynamic that they worship their mother, and so there's a strong sense of guilt that creeps in there. But that's not what Lewis writes. This is a great observation again by this man Ward. Digory is not told by Aslan that a stolen apple will lead to his mother's unhappy recovery. He's told by the witch that it will lead to her happy recovery. He's got the story wrong. It's not that Aslan tells him that if you steal the apple, it will lead to an unhappy recovery. It's rather the witch tells him it will lead to her happy recovery. That's what he's told. So it's only after the event that Digory is told by Aslan that only after that an unhappy recovery is what would have happened if he had stolen the fruit rather than keeping it for the purpose. He doesn't know that beforehand. The only thing he's been asked to do is obey, but there are no consequences told in advance. Right? Not before the fact, after the fact. It's very important. He's just, bring the apple to me. I'm going to use it for this purpose. He's not told that if he had stolen it, this would have happened. Only after he's done the right thing, he said, actually, if you'd done that, it would have done this, but it would have had a very bad outcome. He doesn't usually do this, by the way. Aslan doesn't usually tell us what would have happened, let alone what would have happened to another character. He tells the character concerned. It's nobody else's business. But in this case, he tells it to Digory because Digory is concerned with it. So Digory has to choose between his love for Aslan and his love for his mother. This is it. This is the real choice here between two loves. And the one for the young boy is extraordinarily powerful. He's capitalized it throughout. It's mother. It's mother. The thought of it makes him blub. He doesn't even care. He's a boy. Boys hate to be seen crying. Do you not want to cry? He doesn't care here. This is entirely appropriate that I should cry. I don't care. Digory, quote, Digory never spoke on the way back, and the others were shy of speaking to him. He was very sad, and he wasn't even sure all the time that he'd done the right thing. But whenever he remembered the shining tears in Aslan's eyes, he became sure. That's what triggers it for him. Aslan sees the boy and knows how tortured he is at the loss of his mother, and Aslan has tears in his eyes. That's the turning point right there. There's compassion. It's not just a command without compassion, it's command with compassion. And he has no idea that by giving Aslan the apple that his mother is going to be saved. In fact, it doesn't even enter his mind. And it's the fact that Aslan has compassion, though, that prompts him to finally give it up. Just that. And that's because Aslan had some of the characters of his mother. He represented the fullness of male and female. And I want to talk about this because, again, this is what's so good about Ward here. I think he absolutely nails this. Although love is always being spoken of in Lewis's works, I said that at the outset, and it's not just there in Lewis's works, it's throughout Christian theology. Paul says the greatest of these three, faith, hope, and love, is love. Faith, hope, charity, or faith, hope, love. Love is the greatest. Greatest command to love God and love your neighbor. It's love that motivates. So it's there in biblical theology. It's in Augustinian theology. Love is the centerpiece. It's in Aquinas. It's in Dante. Love is what moves the stars. The last word in every one of the three canticles is stars, and it's love that moves the stars. So love motivates all actions in Christian theology. Okay? But then Venus represents love, and his mother represents Venus for him in some ways. And so there's another Venus that needs to come on with and so does Jadis for that matter. She is a Venus that is infertile, self-idolatrous in a sense, demanding worship from all others, giving herself to no one. Hates fertility. What's the connection here with Aslan then? Because Aslan is a male lion. He could have presented her as a lioness. This is I think, the best part of this discussion by Ward. By the way, no, I won't talk about this. Why is it blessed be he and not blessed be she then? Since Venus is a goddess, the unfathomable feminine principle, the mother of mothers, why is Lewis not prepared to feminize Aslan? That's the question. How come? And it's a good question because Aslan does appear as a lion, but he also appears in other guises. If you have read the whole of Narnia, he appears as an albatross in the Voyage of the Dawn Treader. He appears as a cat in A Horse and His Boy. He appears as a lamb also in Voyage of the Dawn Treader and elsewhere. So he doesn't only appear as a lion, he appears in other guises. Why can't he just make Aslan a lioness here, since the emphasis is on a right view of femininity? Because we get the wrong view of femininity in Jadis, who is called the whore, in the whore of Babylon, right? Babylon the Great. This is a distorted, a wrong view of femininity. And the answer is the imagination, says Ward, and I agree with Ward. I think he's entirely correct here. The major imaginative difficulties arose when one attempted to depict God in feminine terms. Now, he discusses this when he's talking about Neoplatonism in Spencer's poetry, and he writes this. The the problem of Spencer's Venus, it is tolerable that in defiance of all tradition, form should be embodied in the feminine image and matter in the masculine, and even called the father of all forms. And he says, it is hardly tolerable, yet I believe we must tolerate it. I think that the sapience of the fourth hymn must be identified with the second person of the Christian Trinity, the Word, etc. He talks about it in another place. This is an essay I'm not going to ask you to read, but it causes great offense. It's called Priestesses in the Church. He's opposed to women clergy. And he imagines a question. Why not in this? When I say it causes offense, there are women who believe, men and women who believe that women ought to be able to serve in pastoral ministry, in the priesthood, as Lewis the Anglican would call it. So I'm just going to read the extract here, and you'll see the connection. Why not? Since God is in fact not a biological being and has no sex, what does it matter whether we say he or she, father, mother, son, or daughter? What's the difference? Right? He doesn't quote it, but Galatians 3:27, in Christ there's no male or female, Jew or Gentile, Scythian or, right? But Christians think that God himself has taught us how to speak of him. To say that it does not matter is to say either that all the masculine imagery in the Bible is not inspired, is merely human in origin, or else that, though inspired, it is quite arbitrary and unessential. And this is surely based on a shallow view of imagery. This is the point. Without drawing upon religion, we know from our poetical experience that image and apprehension cleave closer together than common sense is here prepared to admit. That a child who has been taught to pray to a mother in heaven would have a religious life radically different from that of a Christian child. Image and apprehension are in an organic unity. So what does he mean by here? When God is referred in Scripture as masculine, not male, he's not a man, but masculine, he says that these are not allegories, but something that Ward calls, I like the phrase, a pupillary metaphor. What do you mean by a pupil? You know what your pupil is in your eye. A pupil is what allows you to focus. It opens up, more light, closes down, less light. When it's bright, shrinks. In the dark, opens up, gets to allow as much light as possible. That allows you to focus. It allows the light in and how much light in. It's a symbol of something. And in Lewis's view, there is no such thing as truth without an image. There's no imageless truth. We bear the imago Dei. We're not God, we bear the image of God. What is the image like? Can we remove all the definition from an image and get to the truth? That's the spirit of the Enlightenment, by the way, to get rid of all images. Get rid of the particularities of them, and particularly the binary particularities of male and female, and heaven and earth, and good and evil. Those binaries that we see right in Genesis 1, which are the differentiation of opposites. There's a temptation to get rid of all of those and say we don't need those images anymore, and we can get to the truth which doesn't have those things. Lewis doesn't agree. He calls it a symbol. But I like the idea of a pupillary metaphor. It helps us to see with greater clarity. And that, referring to God as feminine, will result in less clarity. It will miss something here. There'll be a distorted image. By the way, as I say, the Babylonians worshipped Ishtar. There are many cultures that worship feminine gods, feminine deities. Where they do, unspeakable cruelty results. It's extraordinary. You wouldn't have thought. It's not making a comment about women. It's making a comment about the feminine principle abstracted. And so again, the Babylonians at Nineveh are extraordinary for their cruelty and contempt for life. They annihilate. So rationally, we have good grounds for saying that God is sexless, but it doesn't follow, therefore, that masculine imagery is dispensable and interchangeable with feminine imagery. That's rationalism pushed too far. So the imagery matters. For me, this really matters as a scholar of literature. I think that images matter. The poet Shelley says that the deep truth is imageless. I think it's the worst thing he ever said. The deep truth is not imageless. The deep truth has an image. By the way, this is also from Priestesses in the Church. He says there are two exegetical principles. First of them, never take the images literally. So don't think that God is a man. So that's the first principle. Everyone gets that. Oh, maybe they don't. Maybe they don't. So you need to state it. That's the first. The second is the purport of the images. That is the pupillary intent, the focus. The purport of the images, what they say to our fear and hope and will and affection, seems to conflict with the theological abstractions. If they do, then trust the images every time. Just stick with it, even though it doesn't make sense. Stick with it. And the comment, abstractions model spiritual reality by means of something else. If we're not going to use the language of poetry, what sort of language will we use? Well, we'll refer to legal metaphors or chemical metaphors or mechanical metaphors, and those tend to be less adequate than the sensuous and the organic and the personal images of Scripture. And what sort of images are? Light and darkness, rivers and wells, seeds and harvests, masters and servants, hens and chickens, fathers and child. Those are the metaphors given in Scripture. God refers to himself as a hen, and we as his chicks. It's only one place, but still, it's a metaphor. Can you get rid of it? No. Don't get rid of the metaphor. Stick with it. Don't get rid of masters and servants because you're opposed to slavery. The Bible's also opposed to slavery. Don't get rid of the images. The images give us a clarity of vision that we need. We need to keep that there. Likewise, light and darkness. Don't go 50 Shades of Grey. Right? Stick with that. There's good in that you may not initially see. And we know, Lewis says, that God forgives much better than we know what the word impassible mean. In historic Christian theology, God is spoken as impassible. He doesn't have any passions. He doesn't have any feelings. But in Scripture, God weeps. Aslan has tears in his eyes. That's a better portrait of God as Lewis reads Scripture than the idea of Aslan being God and therefore being impassible and capable of feelings. That wouldn't work. So he's sort of blending the masculine and the feminine in that. There's compassion just as a mother for her children, right? Or a hen protecting the little chicks under her wings, willing to offer her own body up to the predator rather than letting the little chicks get killed. Likewise, Lewis would argue that we know that God is a father much better than we know what sexless mean. What does sexless mean? What does that mean? Can you and I even fathom what that means? I don't think so. Most people, when they gender identify, they identify themselves in terms of the opposite of what they know they are. It's funny how that works. Because that's the imaginative framework, more or less. I can conceive of this, I can conceive of that. I can say I'm both, but it's still the binary there. I'm just going to say I'm that by a fiat act of my word. I am now this. Then I can get the surgeries to make me. Does that make me, unmake me what I already am? I don't think so. It's sort of a metaphysical reality. And the physical matches that. And again, that fits with the whole. Note that as I say, when Aslan commands the apple be brought from the western garden and brings health to a ailing mother, he then pairs off the male and female characters and encourages them to laugh. Much like Sarah laughs when she's fertile. She laughs. You didn't. Why did you laugh? I didn't laugh. Oh, yes, you did. You laughed. It's an extraordinary passage. Why does she laugh? Joy. But more than that, there's something ridiculous about this whole scenario. I'm beyond fertility. How is this possible? So this is, it is sort of a fairy tale form of Genesis, sort of. But it's leaning in the direction of associating it with Venus and all the associations of Venus. So it's not just a fairy tale. It leans in the direction of Venus because Venus has greater significance here again. Jadis is Ishtari or Lilith, a sort of a toxic femininity. Nobody talks about toxic femininity. It's toxic masculinity. It's toxic femininity. There you go. And note that he doesn't have to depict toxic masculinity because nobody is tempted to worship toxic masculinity. That it's repugnant. But beauty, love, nobody worships war. The god Mars, nobody worships Mars. Very few. There's nothing life-giving there. You don't want to worship that. He might be on your side to destroy your enemies, but you don't want to worship that. You sort of hate that God. Because that God only brings destruction, but love brings life. Gladly worship that. There's a lot of Venus worship. But here it's Venus with its fullness in a different sense. I think this is correct. And I think it's important that I talked about it today because it connects the themes of the Course in a way that some of the other books in Narnia don't do. And it's particularly important later on when we come to the Four Loves and also Till We Have Faces, which is to say is his best work. Any other comments or questions? You didn't even ask any, but comments or questions about this? These are hard books to talk about in one lecture. If you're a teacher and thinking about how to do things, like how do I just go through it, in this chapter this happens, this chapter? No, I mean, that doesn't add anything. You want to get, well, what is the central theme, the central plot device, the central conflict, the motivation, and then how does it deal with the other works? And that's what I thought all of this was here. It really was connected. Like, and what is all these things have to do with one another? I do think this is it. So that's it. Okay, next time then, what shall we do? Which one of the Narnia books do you want me to do? We can only do 5 of them, by the way. So this is the problem. I'm going to do The Last Battle last, and I'm going to do The Silver Chair second last. So you got 1. Which one of the ones do you want me to handle? Very difficult. Horse and His Boy, Voyage of the Dawn Treader, what's the other one? Prince Caspian. Which of the 3? 1 of 3. Tough. Because that's the next one we're going to do as well. And that will be after reading week. Oh, it won't be because we have the exam or the midterm. By the way, the midterm, I said already, 75 minutes. It's a 1-hour essay question. You can take 75 minutes if you want. You can take less time, but it's intended to be like a 1-hour essay question. I hear no answers. I will stop there.